Hello, everyone. Uh, Welcome to this Sci-Tech Asia Book Forum to celebrate the launching of a wonderful book, Moving Crops and the Scales of History, recently published by Yale University Press. As I said, it's a great book. If I had to choose one book about crops as a major driving force in human history, probably this would be it. My name is Gonçalo Santos. I'm a social cultural anthropologist and STS scholar based at the University of Coimbra in Portugal. I'm also the director of the international research network Sci-Tech Asia that is organizing this event. I will be the moderator of today's discussion, and I'm very much looking forward to it. We have a significant number of registrations, but I know that looking at the screen now at the numbers of participants, only some people managed to join the live event today. So many thanks, everyone, wherever you are. As a token of our appreciation, we shall be distributing discount codes from Yale University Press to help you purchase the book at discount rates, wherever you are. It doesn't really matter where you are. We will soon be sharing the discount codes via the chat box. Before moving on to the discussion, let me introduce our distinguished guests. We have a truly international lineup today. It will be a truly cosmopolitan conversation, pretty much like the overall orientation of the book. Let me start with the authors. They are all present here: Francesca, Barbara, John, and Tiago. Welcome to Sci-Tech Asia. Let me begin with Francesca Bray, Professor Emerita of Anthropology at the University of Edinburgh. She's an historian of agriculture and of science, technology, and medicine in pre-modern China. In my view, she's probably one of the most brilliant and creative historians around. Her list of publications is too long to enumerate here, but perhaps it all started with the agricultural volume in Joseph Needham's Science and Civilization in China back in 1984. In Texas, we have Barbara Hahn, professor of history at Texas Tech University. She studies and teaches Southern history and global history, agriculture, and the history of capitalism and the history of technology. She's the author of many books, including Making Tobacco Bright, Creating an American Commodity. In Chennai, we have John Bosco Lourdusamy, Associate Professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Science at the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. Is the author again of many books, including Science and National Consciousness in Bengal and Religion and Modern Science in Colonial Bengal. In Philadelphia, we have Tiago Saraiva, Associate Professor of History at Drexel University, co-editor of the journal History and Technology. His book, Fascist Pigs, Techno-Scientific Organisms and the History of Fascism, was awarded the FIFA Prize for the Best Scholarly Book in 2017. We also have three distinguished commentators to discuss the book and ask some provocative questions. In Atlanta, we have Ellen Ann Curry, Melvin Kranzberg Professor in the History of Technology at the School of History and Sociology at Georgia Institute of Technology. She's the author of, most recently, Endangered Maize, Industrial Agriculture and the Crisis of Extinction. In Beijing, we have Du Xinhao, Associate Professor at the Institute for the History of Natural Sciences at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Is the author also of several remarkable books in Chinese, including most recently Agronomy Knowledge in Daily Use Books in the Mid and Late Ming Dynasty. And finally, in Delhi, we have Richa Kumar, Associate Professor of Sociology and Science and Technology Studies at the Indian Institute of Technology. She is the author of Rethinking Revolution, Soybean, Chopals, and the Changing Countryside in Central India. Well, the discussion today will be structured in the following manner. First, the authors will provide a brief introduction of the book. We will then have the commentators to share the reflections, some reflections and ask some questions. And then the authors will have the opportunity to respond to those questions. Finally, we'll open the debate with the audience. There will be at least 30 minutes for a debate with the audience. So before we begin, I would like to ask everyone to mute your microphones, please, in case you haven't done so, and switch off your cameras. It is time to sit tight and watch the show now. I think we're in for a long journey into movings and routings and flows and circuits of crops and plants across space and time. Francesca, the floor is yours, please.
Right. Well, I will try and master the technology here. First of all, I want very much to thank Gonzalo and the Sci-Tech team for giving us this marvelous opportunity, not just to present our work, but to have such extraordinary feedback as is promised on it. And so thanks to all of you, and thanks also to Helen, to Shinhao, and to Risha for kindly agreeing to give us comments. Okay. I think I have successfully shared the screen. Let me introduce our book in a nutshell. And after I've given a general introduction, Tiago will give a couple of examples of crops just to show you how it works out in practice. So, moving crops and the scales of history. As technical artifacts, the kinds of artifacts and commodities that historians of technology and global historians are fascinated by, I think, and we all thought, that crops were irresistibly interesting. So crops are plants whose patterns of movement humans seek to shape and control through cultivation. And their forms of movement through time and space are multiple. They grow, spread, and reproduce. Though as crops, these natural forms of movement are modified and channeled by humans, not always as successfully as they would wish. Then they move between ecologies and environments, or they're taken along on human travels. And then another dimension, they are themselves deep time travelers. They have long genealogies and histories. These histories often span centuries or millennia. They span continents, modes of production, and regimes of value. So human efforts to move crops along these various dimensions have been a key driving force in our history. And the good thing about crops is that everybody who is in a settled society depends on them. So these efforts are very well documented across a very wide span of places and periods. As authors then, we saw a comparative study of crop mobilities as an opportunity to experiment with some scales, with space, time, and other scales in historical writing, in order to challenge what we saw as some of the limits and conventions which global historians are continually coming up against. So as a team, we four authors brought together intersecting perspectives from different disciplines within history of technology, history of science, and so on. Some were more rooted in history of science. Others have economic expertise. Some have an expertise in plant sciences. Others work on technology or commodities or food. We all overlapped, but some were more specialized than others. And also our regions and eras of expertise were quite far-flung, from colonial India to fascist Europe to Latin America, the plantation era Atlantic, early China, Southeast Asia, and so on. In the process of this collaboration, we sought out a core concept, and it came into focus for us in the course of discussions with many other historians, and that was the cropscape. And we decided to define the cropscape as an assemblage, that is to say, something constantly contingent and shifting, but an assemblage of peoples, places, creatures, technologies, matter, ideas, and all the other elements which form a whole within a crop flourishes or fails. As I said, as assemblages, cropscapes are continually shifting and evolving. So they never step in the same stream twice. And as scapes, we know that there are scapes everywhere today, but the point about a scape is that this means that it is a deliberate framing on the part either of ourselves as historians, or very often what we're interested in is the framing by our historical actors. So a cropscape is a product of a choice of focus and a choice of framing. And we asked ourselves, how do some specific cropscapes, with their huge casts of actors, move through time and space? When you have all these elements, which among them is transmitted? What's shed? What new elements enter the cropscape? How do they morph? How do they reproduce? How do the humans involved think that something is essential? How do the crops actually cope with, say, environmental stress in a new environment? So thinking creatively with cropscapes allowed us to engage with some very basic elements of historical analysis. Let's see now if I can. Oh God, hang on. There we are. We chose 6 analytical categories, historical analytical categories for our chapters. So as you see here, times, places, sizes, actants, since we're all interested these days in agency that is human and more than human, compositions, and reproductions, bringing us back to the original seeds from which we started. Each of our chapters consists of a mosaic of contrasting cropscapes. Some are recognizably major crops like rice or wheat or cotton, and others are much less familiar on the world historical scene. And these include, for example, date palms or cashews or yams or marigolds. So we choose our cases, our focus within these particular cropscapes to illustrate a range of different scales and to have complementary and contrasting focuses, and to set up conversations between cases that would propose unexpected ways to view and to apply the analytical category in that specific chapter, with also, of course, conversations between the different chapters. And let me just illustrate briefly with one chapter, which is times. Times plays with time scales, with periodizations, with temporalities, as well as chronologies. So plants have their own rhythms. Humans modify these rhythms when they grow them as crops. But crops, in turn, set many of the human rhythms of farming life or of market cycles. States, industries, businesses, as well as farmers all seek to discipline agricultural time, but they also have to accommodate the natural temporalities of the cropscape and its social temporalities. And these may shape the history of a society or even the ways in which that history is interpreted. So in times, we took very different cases. We took date palms, which we looked at, as Tiago will explain, from a longue durée perspective of how they spread across continents and what they took with them. We looked at tobacco, in this case, as how the life of a plant is modified, but yet resists modification by its cultivators and what the implications are for their, if I can shorthand, mode of production. In rice, we were looking again at the temporalities of the plant and how those shift depending on whether you grow it intensively or extensively, including in the Green Revolution. For the case of cocoa, we took the intermeshing of family life, farm life, and tree life. And for millet, we looked at a crop that appears, dominates, fades, almost disappears, and then becomes resurgent in the modern era. How does that inform us about our conventional views of periods and chronologies. So all these interweavings of history between the life cycles of plants, those of humans, those of institutions, and the periods of society, it suggested all kinds of intriguing possibilities for rethinking how we do historical chronologies, periodizations, and temporalities. If you take cropscape then as not just an object, but as a method where you pay conscious attention to how you make choices about selecting cases, selecting scale, selecting frame, this forcefully draws our attention to the politics of our historiography, our choices, and it pushes us to reflect on the genealogies of our own ways of knowing. So we found that the cropscape allowed us to make new connections between global and local, between longue durée with microhistory, and between people, plants, and places with more abstract concepts, tastes, beliefs, skills, political ideologies, or economic forces. While the cropscape focuses attention on crops and agricultural systems, we felt that it actually was a good example of ways in which you could develop methods and breadth of vision to open new perspectives for global history more generally, and to provide some effective new tools for writing histories of the material world. So I will now hand over to Tiago to illustrate with two very intriguing, what we found very intriguing cases. There.
Thank you, Francesca. Thank you, Gonçalo, and for the invitation, for organizing this, and thanks for everyone who's on Zoom, wherever you are. And so the first case that we thought it could be a very good illustration of our methods, of the way we developed our arguments, is the date palm tree. And of course, it seemed obvious that dates are good to think with when we are inquiring about time. And so you probably know this is something that we try to do throughout the whole book, sometimes more successfully than others, in having this kind of, you can call it puns, between, dates and time. We have all these kinds of things in all our riffs. And here, but more than that, what is so good, what we thought was so good to think with date palms, is that they are an easy object in a way for a very topic, global history written in the longue durée, meaning that we can think of date palms, the first cropscapes of wheat date palms. So in ancient Sumer, then how did that travel to Arabia Peninsula, then into North Africa, from North Africa, crossing the Atlantic to the Americas, and finally having the modern date palms of California that are still there in the Coachella Valley. And so here we have it's a longue durée history, but a very topic one where things start in ancient Sumer, going always east to west, with good demarcations between what is modern, what is non-modern, what is traditional. And when we start to investigate the actual tree and to ask questions, that are from the sensibilities, that we bring as historians of technology, as historians of science, we actually find out other interesting things to say about date palm trees, and actually challenging, those topical global histories of crops. And maybe the most obvious one, and bringing on the issue that crops, one of the interesting things about crops is that they travel, but they are also settled. They are in place. Those two things, they need a soil, and that it's something that comes to the forefront when we explore what is a date palm cropscape, and namely what's an oasis. Yes, the oasis date palm tree settles new places, inhospitable places many times. But the canopy of a date palm tree, is never wide enough to provide shade, for other crops to sustain a community inside the oasis. So it needs exchanges with the exterior. So it's something that settles new lands, the oasis, the date palm oasis, but it's always open to communication, and to long excuse me, and to exchanges with other places. And the date itself is, we can call it a commodity, and it travels long distances. It keeps well, so it has the date palm tree oasis is actually one very good example of something that is settled, and at the same time that brings us to stories of long distance connections. It's also an investment. Many times it was put in place, so it needs sophisticated technology, irrigation technology. It needs investments. It needs capital, and so there are many modern elements of the date palm tree oasis that we normally think of when looking at those cropscapes for example, in North Africa, and how did they connect the Mediterranean to sub-Saharan Africa, and that leads to the long distance trade routes across the Sahara. And so here we see, and when we bring these elements, that questions of big questions in global history, where did capitalism emerge? Where normally you will have stories about Europe and you will have stories about Amsterdam that we have in other reefs. Actually, the date palm tree point to the very modern dimensions of early and capitalist dimensions of actually what goes into making a date palm oasis. And then the opposite movement, and just giving you a hint of how we build up our reefs. So like, okay, we try to disturb a little bit the alleged traditional dimensions of date palm oasis. Now let's go the other in North Africa or in Arabia, and let's go to California and to supposedly the most industrialized version of agriculture we have in the 20th century. And yes, they are modern. Yes, they are called, it's actually in California, it's how it is known. It's the date palm industry in California. And it was, as you would expect, much of it was built on practices that actually came from the Middle East. American plant hunters that learned how to cultivate date palm trees from Arab countries. Actually, that's the image that you have there. It's actually, so you see, it's a picture from a book by Paul Popenoe, a U.S. Department of Agriculture plant hunter, and who was invested in bringing date palm culture into California. And yes, there is Orientalism there, but there is also there are very industrialized dimensions of what happened in California that comes from the Middle East, and it namely obsession with reproducing the same kind of trees. And so how you choose the shoots of the date palm tree that to reproduce the same. So we can call it actually cloning. That's how Californians called it. So yes, California was built on those practices that came from the Middle East. But more than that, when you then look into the detail of how you cultivate date palm trees, how you pollinate trees in California, then very traditional dimensions of agriculture came into play. It's the date palm oases of California are family owned. The workers are quite skilled. The palmeros, it's always same families. And then more interestingly enough, what was a crop that in the Middle East and in North Africa sustain long distance relations, in California, actually dates don't travel far away, or at least they travel only inside the US for domestic markets. They are dates, US dates are not exported. They are local, they are family, so they are family owned, they are produced by skilled workers, so those are the kinds of things that we try to do in all the reefs with all the crops that we played with. So playing with topic ideas of global history, turn them upside down by looking in detail of how a cropscape come into being. So I'll pass now to another example, and thank you, Francesca. And this has to do with so this is with the chapter on actants that Francesca already made reference to, and we have a reef there that we were doubting actually if to use that image that you see there in the slideshow, to use it as our cover for the book, because so it has that playfulness again that we wanted readers to feel when they read the book, when they and it in a way that playfulness it's part of our process of writing as well, and how we made our discussions, how the different reefs came into being, and that elephant image, it's a really good reflection of that. On the other way, it also tells you, of course, it also suggests to consider seriously the happiness of the animals, to consider to see the agency, and to treat the agency of animals, of non-humans, and to take that seriously. What does it mean to take seriously, the feelings of an elephant? And that's the kind of questions that we were asking in that elephant reef. And elephants, well, no one that has written about or worked with or thought even briefly about Southeast Asian history, would doubt about the significance of elephants, even in traditional historiographies of how, and you can think about the role of elephants as war elephants for the making of kingdoms in Southeast Asia. They will be present in all the stories, but interestingly enough, they are not just used as fully domesticated animals. That's like one of the things that elephants really problematize agency, is that if you want to sustain an army of elephants, well, you have also to keep forest reservations. You have to keep places where elephants are able to forage, and that you actually pay tribute to the non-fully domesticated nature of relationship between humans and elephants. And this is particularly salient when we're thinking about the role of elephants in the tea cropscape of Assam. So it's a cropscape that we explore in more than one reef. And that's something else we also do through the books. We go and repeat and see it to underline how this is all about the selections of these historians and the options that the historians make, that we can see it from different angles. Well, here we try to see it in this reef from the point of view of the elephant. And the elephant is fundamental for the making of a teascape in Assam, in Northeast India. The elephants were used to actually clean up the land, to get to clean up the forest, and they are fundamental for surveying the properties. So it's like, and you see from top, and you see like the surveyor of the tea plantation sees the plantation from the point of view of the elephant, which you could actually call it like it's seeing, to use famous Jim Scott's points of view, it's like it's seeing like a state, right? And surveying for making a new plantation, it's seeing like a state as well. Surveying on the mounting an elephant is seeing like a state. That's one point. That's one way of seeing it. The other way is that, again, taking seriously that thinking seriously that an elephant is never a fully domesticated animal, well, sometimes the elephant actually remembers that those seascapes, they are places where they used to forage as well, and so many times they become destructive elements, and it's part of managing the plantation to actually kill elephants. And so the double nature of the double nature of the presence of the elephant in the seascape of Assam really allows us to think about the importance of seeing it, trying to see like an elephant, and trying to see what happens when we take that position. And this is again the kinds of options that we've been taking throughout the whole book. Try to come up in collective conversations between the four of us, what perspectives could be interesting to tell new stories. And I will end here to have the feedback from the rest of you. So many thanks again for the opportunity for sharing our work with you all.
Thank you so much, Francesca and Tiago. I would like to invite now Helen to share her thoughts on the book, please.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, for the opportunity really to comment on this wonderful book, and also to dialogue with authors that I've truly learned so much from, not just here in this work, although that's certainly the case, but across many contributions, many conferences and exchanges. My reflections today emerge not from any particular knowledge of the history of science and technology in Asia, for which I kind of apologize for that shortcoming here in this forum, but instead really as a historian of agricultural science and technology. And it's as a historian of agricultural science and technology, or of science and technology more generally, that I want to focus our attention for a moment on experimentation. It's just 2 pages into Moving Crops that the authors first describe their book as a, quote, experimental work, characterizing it as an experiment aiming towards the decolonization of historical scholarship, an effort towards what they describe as more liberated forms of history. So in what ways is it an experiment? Well, first, we're reminded that it's an experiment in form, in terms of its organization, and furthermore, also an experiment in collective writing. And I think we've heard a bit about that already. But it is, of course, cropscapes themselves that are the real experiments here. As the authors write, quote, crops and cropscapes offer a novel, indeed experimental approach to the writing of global histories, because they are at once inherently local, a concrete product of a specific time and place, and ineluctably mobile, whether in their components and spaces shifting over time, or their travels into new niches or across the globe. And we've certainly had a good characterization of that in the discussion already. And it's this last vision of experimentation with the cropscape, in which an event that's specific to a time and place is also imbued with a significance that extends beyond its temporal and geographic origin, that I think most firmly links our author's experiment with those conducted by a subset of actors that are very familiar to historians of science, only a few of whom actually make their way into the pages of Moving Crops. So I'm thinking, of course, of the researchers based at agricultural experiment stations and other institutions, especially state institutions, who have historically been tasked with the improvement, so-called, of agriculture, a category of scientific worker whose ranks have steadily expanded since the 19th century. These actors' experiments, so things like trials of varieties, soil fertility treatments, cultivation techniques, they were similarly a concrete product of a specific time and place, and yet by virtue of the specific circumstances of their production, especially unequal hierarchies of knowledge, were also thought to impart insights more widely applicable. Now, these experiments, and especially dogmatic insistence on the superiority of the knowledge that they produced, has often come in for critique from historians of science and agriculture. So consider that in Moving Crops, we learn of how Green Revolution seeds tested on breeders' experimental plots, introduced or exacerbated inequalities once they moved into actual farmers' fields. Within state-funded agricultural institutions, experiments have often been seen as essential to scaling up. And the pursuit of scaling up is now acknowledged, as the authors discuss in their study of sizes, as a source of a wide range of socio-agroecological woes. Now, starting in the 1970s and 1980s, when an increasingly well-defined and well-organized transnational discipline of agroecology began to take shape, social science researchers and others increasingly reclaimed agricultural experiment as a category relevant to the characterization of farmers' activities. Farmers were, in this view, inveterate experimenters, invested in and skilled at trialing varieties and cultivation methods on their own land, deciding what worked best for them and disregarding the rest. And this move, in terms of speaking in terms of experiment, was really intended to disrupt the hierarchies of knowledge that had been institutionalized in agricultural experiment stations, spaces where experiments produce knowledge for farmers that was thought better than the knowledge they could produce for themselves. In the world of agroecological or farmer-centered agricultural science, farmers' experiments, on-farm experiments, were valorized as providing the knowledge most relevant to those same farmers and were offered as signs or evidence of farmers' expertise. So assigning experiments to farmers was intended to disrupt the hierarchies of knowledge in agriculture that had ossified in the previous 100 years and more. And it's clearly this version or a version of this reclaimed understanding of experimentation in relation to agriculture that the authors align with most in the text of Moving Crops, in their celebration of historical experimentation and the varied insights it might produce. But since there's no direct grappling with these radically distinct and differently powerful visions of experiment, in a book about agriculture that so explicitly declares itself both experimental and capable of imparting insights that can travel, right? Insights that influence our understanding of agriculture and technology and history. So because there's no discussion of the rhetorics and the politics of experimentation, I wanted to take the opportunity here to ask the authors for a reflection on this. Is experimentation always good? And how can we be sure that our experimental methods remain oriented to the just and the liberatory, since in the domain of agriculture, we have examples of them having not done that? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. I would just move on to the next commentator, perhaps, also for the sake of time. I would like to invite Xin Hao, please.
Okay. Hi. Thanks, Professor Bray, for the invitation, which gives me the opportunity to communicate with everyone. Congratulations on the publication of the book, and I would like to express my gratitude to the authors who have taught me a lot from the book. For a very early period, the Chinese already vaguely think that crops involved an intricate system in 吕氏春秋, which was published more than 2,000 years ago. It was stated that crops are fed by heaven and raised by earth, and that harvest also depends on the people who work on crops. Therefore, those three elements, that is earth, heaven, and people, together with crops, jointly making up a complex community. According to the ancient Chinese, moving crop away from its original place can sometimes lead to disastrous results. As a popular Chinese saying goes, sweet mandarin orange trees will bear sour fruits after being transplanted from south of Huaihe River to north of Huaihe River. Unlike the vague description made by the ancient Chinese of crops and their mobility, the ambitious and outstanding work started by proposing a refined definition of cropscape. I'm deeply impressed by the two aspects of the book. The first aspect is that the book pay attention to many minor crops in addition to such staple crops as wheat, maize, and rice, and including those minor crops in the author's model of history process. The other except is that although moving crops are the theme of the book, the author's attention is not limited to moving crops and the new cropscapes created by them. As shown in the description of the declining tea industry in China and the long history of tulips in the Ottoman, the authors there observe what changes may appear regarding the crops that remain at their place of origin. I think the greater contribution of the book is that it offered a new alternative to history writing rather than revealing a brand new or hidden histories of some crops. More importantly, the book provides writer of macro histories and micro histories around the world with a new tool, a new framework, a new framing method with multiple focuses and diversity skills. When scale or focuses are changed, this tool can capture more historical details, play effective roles in study on objects' movement and change, and significantly inspire Chinese agricultural history research. As Chinese is one of the global centers in which crops originate, the movement of crops is also a key topic that attracts great attention from research of the Chinese agricultural history. The attention given by scholars to move crops in the Chinese history is mainly shown in the two aspects. The first is the studies on the crops introduced into China, so the Silk Road since the Han Dynasty, and those introduced into the country from Americans in the Ming and Qing Dynasty. The most representative studies, including those made by Batu de la Fei, He Pingti, and Wang Ziming, but their focus are merely limited to the introduction, expansion, and spread of new crops. Unlike the author of this book, those scholars rarely pay attention to how a new community is set up in the competition between the new crops and the local ones. If new crops, local crops, and the introducer of the new crops, growers of both the new and local crops are perceived as extra, scholars may get a certain new conclusion by applying the extra network theory. The second aspect is made up by the research on the movement of local crops in China. For example, according to the Timothy Bray, being promoted by the government, lowland rice and its know-how was introduced from the southern China to North China in the late imperial period in Wayne. Recently, I found in literature that the Minister of Agriculture proposed to grow lowland rice in North China in 1958 to increase the country's grain yield, help driving lowland rice from the South China to North China again. If we extend the period of our study by looking at those two government programs jointly, we might come to certain different insights. We can see that this book is perfect, but if I were allowed to nitpick a little bit, I found it's somewhat difficulty for a book to be collectively written by different authors specializing in different fields, who decided to break the boundary between the chapter as well as between paragraphs. The pros of this is to put the author's representative strength in crop history research into play and breaking through the restraints in time, scope, and languages. But the coin is perhaps that same crops can repeatedly appear in different chapters. Also, I understand that those crops are used to tell different stories. Their repeated appearance make the book, the narrative, disordered to some extent. Of course, I understand that the authors intend to explain to readers the unique strength of cropscape in writing global history with the help of a variety of crops. In other words, the new methods of writing history and its theoretical narrative are what the author focused on, while the stories in the book are only examples to help the readers understanding the theory, I would like to ask if the author have any plan to write a book on a single crops with the concept of cropscape. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Xinhao. I would like to move on to the third commentator, inviting Richa Kumar to the Zoom stage, please. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this discussion today. It's really a privilege to be here. And I have also read the works of all the authors, not just this one, and learned so much from them over the years as I have developed myself as a scholar. So it's really a pleasure to be talking about this particular book, which I would say is really a magisterial work. It brings together, and I think one of the most marvelous things is one cannot figure out the voice of the different authors individually in the book. It's somewhere it meshes together so well. I mean, of course, we know the specializations of the authors, but it's been put together so seamlessly. So if people don't know, then it works really, really well as a written work. And I think that in itself is such a laudatory thing, that it's written so beautifully. So I want to keep my remarks brief. I'll speak about 3, maybe 4 things. The first is around the riff of waste and value, which I found very interesting. And I want to share some work from my own experience and research that has been done with a collective, an activist collective in India around the idea of waste and value. I then want to talk a little bit about doing history and the politics of historiography that Professor Bray spoke about earlier. And then possibly a little bit around historicizing capitalism and the idea of non-human agency. So I'll be brief. The waste and value riff, which the particular example that I found very, very interesting was on cashews, and how the cashew fruit was considered valuable for the native people in Mozambique, and then and it was completely considered to be useless and terrible from the point of view of the Portuguese, and then eventually how instead of the fruit, it was the nut that gained value as a commodity due to various other kinds of processes coming together. There's a lot of other interesting things one can do around waste and value depending on whose vantage point we are talking about. For me, the story that I'm interested in very briefly sharing is around buttermilk. And buttermilk, which is a product, and broadly, as I was just thinking about this, the word cowscape came into my mind, because I'm talking about, cows, buffaloes, milk. When you convert it into ghee, whatever is left over is that buttermilk, which is the whey protein. And if you go back, 50, 60 years ago, before you had the technology to convert milk into milk powder, that buttermilk was effectively a waste product. So households that converted milk into ghee, that buttermilk was either thrown away or typically given away for free to laborers coming from oppressed caste and class groups within rural society, especially in the north in India. And for them, it had huge nutritious value. It's full of protein. And just to give you a comparison, today, the same whey protein that is purchased by athletes and by people wanting to build their muscles, it's very expensive, this whey protein. That is what this buttermilk was, which was a waste product then. But as milk got commodified, this waste product was no longer available. And it had very, very important implications for the diets of oppressed class groups, especially Dalit laborers in the region where I studied. And just to give a sense around, and there are several other, foods that come in the same thing. Millets has a similar kind of story, or fruits like local fruits versus outside sort of fruits that are now privileged. Local fruits are sort of now considered to be backward and useless fruits. But all of these stories would not have come to the fore if we, so this is all a result of a collaborative project that we have undertaken. It's me, a researcher activist based in Bangalore who works on health and agriculture. But most importantly, the people contributing to this research are this group of Dalit farmer and laborers in northern India, near Lucknow, in Awadh, in Uttar Pradesh. And it's their stories and their experiences that are finally coming through. And so the second point I really wanted to, talk about, for me, this was very important. In the book, you write about the politics of historiography, and, the last sentence of your introduction says, how you frame what you choose to write about, what case you want to choose, what vantage point you want to choose. But I think I want to take it a little further back. It's not only what we want to write about, it's who we want to write with. I think that becomes critical, because it's only when you get and at the end of your book you talk about writing global history from the global south, and the lack of resources, the lack of funding, the lack of research scholars to help put together endnotes. I thought that was fantastic. But that's absolutely right. Who do we choose to write with? Because it's so difficult to put together the resources, and especially to try and bring marginalized groups into this process of writing and reflection. There are so many everyday demands and crises that people are dealing with all the time. And so in this particular work that we have done, we've tried to bring together Dalit farmers and laborers to write about their own history. So when we did a survey in these few villages, and the survey team was from the young people in those villages themselves. So they went and they studied their own households. And then they wrote about and reflected upon their own pasts. So the fruit story came from the youth group themselves. And the buttermilk stories came from, the focus group discussions that many of the women that we were working with, they were doing with their own, fellow people in the villages that they were working in. So I think this question of writing history and the politics of who do we choose to write with is a very, very important question that in academia we certainly must confront. It's one thing to say that, there are very few articles talking about, the researcher, for example, as in anthropology, the researcher and the fieldwork assistant, and how often does the fieldwork assistant actually get to be a co-author on the piece, or in economic surveys, people doing the survey, do they actually get authorship in terms of doing some analysis of the survey data? So I think those were very important questions that were raised. Two other brief points I want to make. One is on the thing I really liked was about how there were two examples that were trying to historicize in some ways bits and pieces of capitalism as a system or as a logic. And one was described here in terms of the date palm, linking the Sahara Desert and the Middle East, elites in Cairo, elites in Arabia, to partly the slave trade, the gold trade, and how different elements of those systems could be understood as elements that we find in, say, capitalist systems today. And the other example was of the Ottoman Empire and tulips, and how the market for tulips in some ways also could be seen in some ways as a so-called modern or capitalist market. And of course, that takes off from Sidney Mintz and his earlier work trying to look at the sort of historicizing the origins of capitalism in the plantation economy, the sugar plantation economy. On the one hand, to me, that's very heartening. But on the other hand, I have this sort of nagging feeling, and I would request the authors to possibly reflect on this, that part of the reason to historicize capitalism and push it further back and to move it from the center of Europe is to, partly say that there are many stories of capitalism. In the process of provincializing Europe or decentering Europe, we want to say that, okay, it could have originated in Arabia or it could have originated somewhere else, some of these forms. And yet, all of the descriptions of this so-called capitalist system, whether in the book or elsewhere, they're talking about capitalism really being cannibalistic on the slave economy, on a so-called gender nature of work, on all kinds of other complicated so-called non-capitalist relations. And so I'm really wondering, why does it make sense for us to even privilege this language of capitalism? Is it because, within a sort of mainstream in some kind of mainstream view, the notion of capitalism and modernity is still seen to be a privileged position, a so-called better position than other kinds of modes of organizing the so-called modern economy. I mean, maybe this is just about using the word capitalism, but somewhere I feel, maybe thinking of other ways to look at economic, political, cultural, social systems that have been put together to move people and things around might be better than privileging the logic or the idea or the concept of capitalism, perhaps. And then the very last point I want to make, if I have a couple of minutes, if I can, is on non-human agency. And I really loved the chapter on actants, and this, of course, the story of the elephant. There's also the story of the two funguses that affected coffee and one that affected rubber, and how that changed the course of history. This question around non-human agency, I'm coming at it from my own work, which is trying to look at chemicals in our bodies. So the impact of pesticides and agrochemicals and what happens to them in our bodies. And one of the things, it's one thing to think, of course, of chemicals as non-human agents and actants in very specific ways. But the chemicals are constantly changing, and our bodies are constantly changing. In some ways, this is not something which is static at all. I can't think of the chemical as one discrete entity, and our bodies as or even soils or water as discrete entities. They enter our bodies and they convert themselves into various kinds of metabolites. They are excreted out. They are coming into our bodies through so many different kinds of ways. And so I found it very interesting to think of Tim Ingold's idea, where he talks about mesh work. I mean, his point is that the difference between humans and non-humans, or between people and things, is really not so much as much as we may like to believe, because our bodies are also taking in materials and excreting out materials all the time, and we are constantly in flux. And things also, unless and until they are maintained with effort, with entropy, things are also coming into being and eroding away all the time. And so if we take into account, and in some ways that is what is the web of life, and so if we try and take this sort of movement and flow of stuff, I suppose, more seriously, then how will that change the way in which we think about agency and we write about agency and about different kind of people and things in the story? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Richa. That's very thought-provoking, really. We'll come back to your comments in a bit. I'll just give the opportunity to the authors to respond to the three commentators. I'd like to invite Barbara and John, I believe. Who speaks first?
I'd love to let John speak.
Okay, John, go ahead.
Okay, am I audible?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Gonzalo, for first of all making this possible, and particularly through the three distinguished commentators. And at the outset, thanks for your kind words about the book. So you really touched and encouraged. I will address a few points within the 5 minutes or so given to me, and then I'll leave it over to Barbara. Taking Helen's point about experiments, of course, you're right that we don't talk too much about experiments, but of course, almost in every case, we do hint at experiments. For instance, when tea is transferred to Assam from China, or when even the local Assam variety is raised to a plantation status, so there was all kind of modifications that had to be done to it, or playing around with the size of the rice, or the periodicity of the rice, or the tobacco, and all of these things. There is certainly a lot of things is going around at the level of science, level of experiments, but of course we are explicitly talking about only in a few cases, like Washington Carver, or in the chapter on breeding. But thinking a book like this, because we wanted to cover all kinds of things. So we just chose a couple of places like Carver and Breeding to talk exactly about experiments. But we certainly take your point. I think it would have been richer to talk more about the experiments as such. And so I will go straight away to one of Richard's points. In fact, in a way, also connecting the two kinds of experiments you talked about. So the experiment of writing, both the form as well as joint writing, and Richard was talking about who we choose to write with. I think one of the ways in which both the experiments could be connected is, of course, next time such book is written also involves some of the, in this case, the experimental space itself. I think Helen was talking more about the labs and other kinds of places, but also other kinds of experimental places like the village and the tribal population and the women who are in their own way scientists. So that's one thing. And yeah, so we very much appreciate Zinyo's highlighting two important things. It's about not only talking about moving, but also staying, but we were very particular about that aspect. So the roots, ROUTS, matter, but then the ROOTS also matter. And that's one of the important things. And also bringing back the aspect of joint writing as an experience. For instance, I have been writing about tea, particularly about technology and other things. So, and normally when we write, so any work on tea, like concentrates on labor, the commercial aspects of women and things like that. And it talks about normally about a particular region. And when I was talking about the role of machines, and coming to the time period of 1880s and the 90s, so my draft on the thing I'm writing on the role of technology separately was almost triumphless, almost, because I don't need to be triumphless about British use of machinery. Looked very triumphalist and how India and tea had finally got the better of Chinese. That only during this joint writing experience, like I was reminded by other co-authors about, we should not look just like that, at the way the British looked at the world market, but we should also look back at China and how tea still, China still played a dominant role in terms of its export to Central Asia, Vietnam, and other places, and how it's not like it just faded away. So the two things, one is that how it stayed there in the place from which it came, and also how we should look at the different narratives. And of course, we also particular about the other point that you know made about our special attention to minor crops. We are very particular, of course, though we don't use the word subaltern too often in the book, or the word peripheries, because we didn't want to get into all the binaries of center and periphery, but we were very conscious in our efforts to go beyond the major different sizes of the crops, or not only the crops, but also the presence in world market. So we were very conscious, and I'm glad that that's being appreciated. And of course, another point from Xinghao is about so we take it as a suggestion right now at least. So the point was about whether we plan to write single crops with the cropscape things. I take it as a suggestion because I'm still working on tea. There's a lot to come, and I should say that I've been definitely influenced. What I was before I got into this cropscape mold was definitely different, and probably like whatever I write in future, and of course others also have been influenced. And also that, as we say somewhere in the introduction, so not only with crops, so we also hint that this cropscape method can be used even with artifacts like Chinaware or porcelain, other things, other commodities. Then finally, like I think just one more minute about Richard's point about waste, and as you rightly pointed out, the meaning of waste. It's looked at differently, not only by different people like the natives or by the Portuguese, but also within a country. So for instance, you take the contemporary situation, that's something which we didn't mention on the book. Within India, like in Goa, the fruit is very fruitfully used for fenny. But if you come to where I'm from the heart of the cashew, well, in the south, so it's still a waste. So we just throw it away. And so recently I heard Pepsi is trying to make a drink out of it. So even now, so it depends also on, within a country it can vary. And also the case of buttermilk is very important also because throughout the book, we have very consciously tried to make all our crops or the products embedded in the social and political life. So one thing I wanted to say, especially, I don't know if it's in the north, but in Tamil Nadu, so buttermilk has not only taken new life, of course, apart from the political things I'm going to come, political, social, it's also the commercial thing. Now we have packaged buttermilk. So that is one thing at the commercial level. But in summer, there is a culture here of political parties setting up pandals, like temporary sheds, where they distribute freely buttermilk in pots, cool as a kind of a sucker for the hot Chennai weather. And of course, I will allow Barbara to particularly talk about this point about capitalism, on which she has worked a lot. But just one line I would add with that, I will close. So I certainly take your point about privileging of capitalism. And of course, there are arguments about can't we have just commercialization without capitalism, or even industrialization without capitalism? So why should we? And in fact, after a Republic of Plants conference in which some of you were there, at least I see 4 or 5 participants here who were there. So recently we had, I don't know if you're able to see, just last week we had this conference. This is a Capacia project by Giorgio Riello, who is at the European University Institute at Florence. So this project is about the Asian origins of global capitalism. So we had a seminar here, Tirthankar Roy and quite a few others were there. So I think I also have to from that again. So it looks like so we are being more inclusive to not attribute all of capitalism origins to Europe, but also like the very name itself, like that itself shows like why it's still this kind of an obsession with capitalism. Like, why should we be so obsessed with the Asian origins of capitalism? There are other things which we can say. So these are things which also, so apart from your compliments, these are very useful, provocative thoughts. Thank you once again. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I'll move on to Barbara. Would you like to respond to John and also to Richa, Shinhao, and Helen? Please, thank you.
Sure. I understand that a lot of people probably have questions and comments, and I'm more interested in what they have to say than what I have to say, so I'll try to be brief. That said, I also want to make sure that I do my part by my co-authors. So it's hard for me to choose kind of an order in which to address these if I'm going to do my part. So I wanted to speak to Helen Curry's comment about experimentation, which was so interesting because, of course, this particular moment, the 20th century and 21st century in the United States, and the use of experimentation as a means of regularizing crops for market and bettering farmers and so on, seems to me to be so very much about science when I think of technology as being so cut and dry. That said, I also think that what I would say about the politics of experimentation is how much it is like turning a plant into a crop. It's about modeling and it's about reproducibility, right? It's all about being able to do it again and do it again and doing it within this shape and this model. And as a result, I think that in a weird way, so many of our actors are actually doing it. They're projecting into the future a model of what they want the crop to be. And this is a big part of the cropscape that they end up producing, I think, or failing to produce, because I think sometimes the visions and the ideologies and the dreams of reproducibility are what trips them up, our actors. And that leads me to Dr. Jinhao's comments. I thought so interesting the idea of following the new crops into areas where local crops have power and examining the interactions between the two. I thought that this was really, and also emphasizing the crops that remain at a place of origin when one crop is moved from one location to another, or one market to another, or produces something different than it used to produce. It strikes me as being the best iteration of what we think cropscapes are for. We, the authors, think cropscapes are for, which is to sort of humble us in terms of recognizing that it's our vision that creates the argument. What we choose to include and the scale at which we choose to look, whether this is the weevil in the cotton field or the Liverpool cotton broker or the farmer on an annual sharecropping contract, these different visions of what that crop is all have a bearing on what the result is. And that sort of experimentation is what we were after. That was a little out of control. Sorry, it's early morning here. Let me speak to Dr. Kumar's comments as well, to Risha's comments about capitalism and tulips. Tiago and I actually wrote most of the tulip section. I think Francesca had a hand in there as well. It was really one of the collectives, but it's also one of the ones that I know better. My sister lived in the Netherlands for a lot of years. The Dutch are still very proud of their tulip history, their flower production. It's a big part of their national identity. And I think it's a big part of the story that historians tell about quote unquote transition to capitalism. That said, I struggle with this myself. When I teach my students, my undergraduates, I try to teach them about mercantilism, right? Merchant capitalism versus capitalism, or what we would call industrial capitalism or post-industrial capitalism. So the difference I try to explain to them is that for us living in a capitalist world, we believe wealth can be grown, that there's more to be made out of what there is in the earth. Whereas for the merchant capitalists, there's a limited amount of wealth in the world. And so they want to get as much of it as they can for their individual nation state. The problem is that that hasn't gone away. I mean, even as capitalism as the corporate form of capitalism in which we live today works to destroy the nation state, and I believe that it does. I also think that they are tied together, and their histories are tied together in really important ways. And that's why it's such a historical mode of behavior. That's why capitalism has a historical moment as opposed to being universal, because it's so tied up to the origins of the nation state and its expansion into colonialism. An upshot, I tell my students, whenever you hear an American politician talking about the balance of trade, they're mercantilists. A capitalist shouldn't worry about that kind of thing. So the transition seems to me to be another piece of ideology. I agree with Risha that this is a fiction that valorizes the West in a way that's completely unjustifiable given the history that we encounter here. And just to finish up, I'll say that this history is on the cover because this image we selected from the cover from the Topkapi Museum in Istanbul, the Tulip Courtiers procession, is from 1588, which is to say it's some 50 years before the Amsterdam tulip bubble. And there were hundreds of shops selling flowers in Istanbul, and it was exploding out from control of the leaders. It's very much a story of markets expanding before Europeans ever arrived. And I think that this is expanding beyond control, I think is what I would say. And this is an important way of reversing the traditional histories and a big part of the politics of what we were trying to do. I'll stop there. I want to hear what others have to say.
Thank you, Barbara. I would like then to open the floor for questions from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, I suppose you can do that in two ways. You can just use the raise hand function, and ask a question orally to the authors, I would like you to turn on the video when you do that and introduce yourself. And you're also welcome to write a question in the chat box, at any moment, or just leave a comment or ask a question. While perhaps the audience gathers their thoughts, I don't see any question in the audience. I do have a question about the aesthetics of the book, which is something that didn't really come up in the comments of the commentators. I was fascinated by the return of music metaphors to organize books. I mean, there is a long tradition, certainly in anthropology, probably coming to mind the name of Claude Lévi-Strauss, using music as an organizing trope of the process of writing, and also of composition, another word that you kind of use also as a metaphor, not just for writing, but for world composition, I suppose. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that, whether it's just happens to be a sort of a casual choice, or whether there's something more to it. Why choose free jazz as the metaphor for your for the kind of aesthetics that you are using to make the various points and conceptual interventions that you are making? So free jazz. Would like to take the free jazz question?
I
Well,
think
it
of
should-
that as being Tiago's question.
It
but
should really be Tiago's question.
Yeah.
Okay. You see how this works. When there are difficult questions, then you no, it's a great question. And so we thought about it, and how actually again it's not just that it's out of use in a way, that, as you were saying, those kinds of metaphors, but that it's also it might not resonate for everyone the same way. And of course, and this goes to some of the questions that some of the other criticisms that were made by the commentators, which is yes, free, and the notion of free jazz, that so that's how we organize the book. That's how we actually, I think that it was a small quartet, and we were around the table, and each of one will go into our rant, then other one would speak, and it wouldn't make any sense to the others, and then let's try and see if actually the chapter makes sense altogether. Some of them they are more cohesive than the others. But this said, and as Alan's point about is it always good to experiment? Well, I think that the experimentation is at least, and responding to that, it's actually it's the first step to knowledge that we are always experimenting, and then yes, the results are not always good, but it's like it's a necessary first step, and that would be my take on that. And so it's an emphasis on the experimentation, that the results are not for we can't take it for granted of what the results are. That's the other thing here, and I think that some of the readers will think that some of the riffs are more successful than others in achieving what we propose we're doing. So it's like, yes, there is. And I thank Richa for that comment, that it's there is coherence, there is some coherence, but in many places it's not just that there are different voices, it's that we are really experimenting with out of our zone of comfort zone, like I'm saying many times, and so we got some criticism for choosing those metaphors from the readers, from our reviewers, namely the music metaphor. But we always thought that actually it actually reflected quite well what we were doing. you know. And then there is Berlin, and then so this was written mostly in Berlin, and there was a jazz scene that deserves talking about. But that was one of the things. Yeah, I have more about that, but okay.
No, it's actually very interesting, and I probably disagree with the readers on the, criticizing you over using music metaphors. I think it's a delightful way to capture very precisely and yet so elusively what you're doing. I think Anand Singh uses the metaphor polyphony to refer to what she's doing, actually, in Mushroom at the End of the World. We have a question from Kezia Kershaw. Someone mentioned plantations earlier. How does your work relate to other bodies of scholarship on plantations, plantationscapes, and/or plantationocene? So who'd like to take up this question? Barbara?
I'll take this one, though I think John will have something to say when I'm done too. Really, I want readers to know that we have relied entirely on the scholarship of other people. So if so our work relates to the bodies of scholarship on plantations and the plantationscape by drawing upon them in order to see the plantation as a part of a cropscape or as an element of a cropscape in which the colonial scene, the world markets, the elephants and the laborers are also actants. But it's also true that as a mode of production, we're very interested in how that moves and why certain crops seem to employ it more readily than others. That's where I'll hand it over to John with tea.
Thank you, Barbara, and thanks for that good question. So one thing, as I already mentioned, is, of course, we have seen works on, I myself have done works on plantation, and there'll be more. And I think we are different in two particular aspects. One is what I already mentioned. So we don't just see how the plantation unfolds in the place we are seeing and how the place where it arrived, but we also continue to focus on from where it came and things like that. And so, for instance, as I said, we take off tea plantations, we hear of particular themes like labor or gender and other such things. But I don't think like you would have come across any work on tea plantation which showcases the elephant in the way, for instance, we have showcased. And even there, when we bring the elephant, we are not just bringing the elephant in terms of just the teascape alone. So we bring the elephant from the ancient India down to the Mughals, and contrast how the politics worked with the elephants, and then the different kinds of, as Tiago is mentioning, the elephant's relationship to the environment and the kinds of things that have to be done, but also the constitutive agency of the elephant and the mahout, the one who trains, and how that mahout's expertise is summoned by the inadequate agency of the plantation, the estate manager. So those kinds of, that's the play, that's the kind of jazzy thing that you see. So it's a different kind of a plantation scene, not the same boring economics and commerce and the labor and the violence and other things. So that's just, I'm giving one example of, and as you'll see in rubber and other things, there are different things. So there are certainly things which are in our approach to plantations, which you will not see in other things. It's precisely because we have used the cropscape method. Thank you.
Tiago?
Just underlining what John was saying, that everything is there. Okay, so plantation scene, yes, is there. Plantations, yes, it's there. It's everything in the book. You can find it anywhere. But like, I think the actants chapter is probably the one where you'll find more about plantations.
Francesca?
Yes. One of the things we got from the plantation scholarship and literature was, and that the cropscape really helped us to think about, was the not just the plantation paradigm, but what the plantation cropscape is embedded in. And so the issue of what Harrow, for example, has explored as anti-commodities and what it is that is actually needed to make a plantation work that doesn't go into the thinking of the people who are operating on a plantation paradigm and saying, you know, this is how we make a plantation efficient. This is what resources we need. It was an opportunity to draw on some of this scholarship, which is going beyond the terms laid down by the plantation experts themselves. The kind of subversive scholarship, which is saying that plantations can only work if they have all these things which are not acknowledged, making them work. And the cropscape opened that up very nicely, I think, from weevils through to yams, through to all kinds of things. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. We have a question from Don Joshin about the rice-scape in Manchuria, northeastern China, generated by Korean migrants in the late 19th century and early 20th century.
Yes, thank
Would you
you.
like to ask the question? Thank you.
Sure. Do you hear me okay? Am I loud enough? All right, thank you.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Briefly, introduce myself. I'm Dongjo Shin. I currently teach at the College of St. Rose in upstate New York. Thank you very much for this beautiful book. I wish I learned the discount code a bit earlier because I already purchased it, but it's okay. And when I read when I heard the word cropscape, to be honest, I had some difficulties to grasp the meaning of that word. But as soon as I see the word rice-scape, it became very clear to me, because my totemic crop is also rice, as an everyday rice eater, even today, this morning. And it also directly related to the article that I'm working on right now. It's about the role of wet rice farming played in the settlement of ethnic Koreans, ultimately ethnic Koreans, or in Chinese, Chaoshenju, in the Sino-North Korean borderland, or Yanbian. So I wanted to run my recent work by the specialists here, especially the authors of the book and the broader audience who are participating in this webinar, if you don't mind. So let me introduce my work very, very briefly. So there were groups of Korean migrants to this borderland, the Sino-North Korean borderland, and they immigrated to China because there were a series of some severe famines in the late 19th century, especially 1860s and 1870s. So may I say they didn't have any choice but to leave their home country and decide to settle down in Northeast China, which was not very easy. But some of them, they didn't have any other farming skills but wet rice farming. So that was also not their choice, but do a wet rice farming in this area. The area where the local Chinese were living there thought is too cold, so unsuitable for wet rice farming. So they are like pioneers, the Korean pioneers that who introduced wet rice farming to this region. Then World War I came. So during the World War I and right after World War I, the price of wet rice increased by more than 50%. So the local landlords, Manchu or local Chinese landlords, they welcomed Korean migrants who were able to do wet rice farming. So a lot of Koreans were brought to Northeast China in this area. And then the Japanese colonial period came, especially in the 1930s. they did the mass migration of Southern Koreans who are very good at wet rice farming. So the landscape of, the wet rice was booming in this particular region, which had been regarded as unsuitable for wet rice farming. And then lastly, the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, came to power, 1949. The Chinese Communist Party also promoted the Koreans' wet rice farming because wet rice, as you know very well, it yielded more than any other crops in the region. Then the problem arose during the collectivization, as the members of Korean rice farmers and Han Chinese dry crop farmers, their work calculated together and equally distributed, their income equally distributed without calculating the different quality or different yield of the different crops cultivated by these two peoples. Ethnic Koreans' income decreased as collectivization started. So ethnic Korean wet rice farmers objected to the collectivization, and they ended up being criticized as
Gonjo, sorry, could you?
Yeah, that's it. So that's
yes.
it. I just finished the very, very brief version of my current work. So I'd like to hear because the book has very, almost no information about the rice cave in this particular region. So I wanted to hear what other specialists can say about this part of history.
Would you like to respond, or perhaps shall we take another question? Because I believe that Haro Matt had a question.
Yes,
Yeah,
I do. Sorry, and I was just typing it as I looked at the time.
Yes, please be brief. Okay.
Yeah.
Hi there.
I'm almost finished typing, so I'll post it in any case. But the question really was, one of the really great things of the book is that the cases are written from a variety of sources, and that's of course one of the arguments that is made in the book about the cropscape. And I wondered whether the authors have had to drop any cases because a variety of sources were not available, or they considered the case too one-sided in terms of description. And of course, the wider question then is, what does this imply for methodology for historians of science, technology, environmental historians, etc.?
I'll add another question from Marisa Wilson, and perhaps you can manage who answers which question. So we have Donjo's question, we have Haro, and we have Marisa's question, which is a question about the concept of cropscapes, opening up spaces for the telling of history and human, non-human relations that move away from stories of oppression, marginalization, and genocide. I don't know if Marisa, if you want to say something to add something to this.
It's just an interest of mine in terms of the telling of plantation stories and how they often come from the perspective. And I think this is very much in line with what the book is trying to do, but in telling the story of, the plantation moment, the dominant capitalist story of sugar, for example, and all of the other stories get lost along the way. Okay, I think that's where we've come to with the book, but is it just trying to push a little bit further in terms of, does this concept have something to offer for, trying to embed, other kinds of stories of, to unlink people from these experiences of victimization, kind of like John Davis did for hunger and famine. And I'll put something in a link here, but I've just come across a really brilliant paper by Eve Tuck called Suspending Damage. It's a movement away from damage-centered research. So I'm not sure if you're getting, but it's kind of a positionality I've been trying to shift towards as well, that is moving away from the telling of stories as kind of telling of damage-centered stories and opening up to stories that are more hopeful for the future that come from the past, I suppose.
Thank you. Would you like to respond in 2 minutes or 3 minutes? Yeah, Barbara, and then Tiago.
I was going to respond, but I think Tiago is best for this one. Go ahead.
Well, I'm not sure if I'm best, but the question about violence and the mode of writing around plantations, it's one that we tried. So, like one example that we tried to grab with is the rubber story, which have been like exactly. It's one of those exemplary most of the rubber stories are the ones all around violence. Namely, when you write rubber only about South American stories and specific South American stories. And exactly that's one where we actually problematize that mode of writing, for example, and where we bring in, like where you consider actually all the elements or other elements of the cropscape, then other stories come in. Where you have more agency of rubber tappers, where you have interesting political movements going on in the Amazon rainforest, or where when you actually change your geographic attention to how rubber develops in East Asia, where supposedly it's the plantation. It's one of the plantation stories in East Asia. Well, you actually also have a very different kind of story of the plantation, where it's just not the monocrop plantation where rubber is cultivated with other things, smallholder stuff. So yes, it's one of those cases where we actually try there to play with the different historiographies around rubber and how we can get away from a very simplifying mode of writing that it just takes the plantation as the only story there to tell is the one of oppression. So that would be one story. And just to briefly to Aro's point is like, well, at a certain moment, one of our readers suggested that we should write the whole book just on sugar, which we thought was not a good idea. And so that this was just so going that there were, so in sugar, the sugar story was maybe one where we had just too many sources or too many so it has been like, again, that would lead us into a way of writing, or there are many ways of approaching sugar, of course, but that will lead us into a mode of writing that people would immediately connect with the plantation story that Marisa was mentioning. And so yes, and then there are, yes, we left many crops out. But maybe Francesca will remind us what crops you wanted to have that we put them out of the book.
Francesca, you have the final word.
Okay, well, I'll try and be very brief. We had reluctantly to leave all kinds of cases out that we had worked on because we just didn't have room for them all. But what happened with many of the cases which might have seemed unsuitable was we sat there, the four of us, and we hammered them into a suitable shape, or we riffed on them until they came up with a suitable tune for us. It was a kind of challenge. So who would have thought that wheat turned out the way it did, for example? And then on Marisa's question, I think an inspiration for all of us was, the work of Judy Carney and others, and Sydney Mintz on, well, I hesitate to say celebrating, but a more joyful account of what goes on in growing things around a plantation, for example. And I think the thing about the cropscape is it allows you to take very different positions of very different actors, subjects, in very different moods. And that was one of the beauties of it. So, of course, you have to have some kinds of sources, and we didn't always have the sources we would have needed to bring out the songs of joy of, I don't know, the cotton workers in Mozambique. I don't think there were many songs of joy. Sorry, was it Angola or Mozambique? But we certainly gave you some joyous weevils. And we could just have given you the weevils being shriveled by pesticides, but we had the weevils swinging from the trees. And so I think there's plenty of scope there. But as always, you know, you can't make bricks without straw. And we were ruefully aware of the fact that trying to look big and trying to focus small is complicated. We could do more with 4 than we could do with 1, but we'd like to welcome more people to our Republic of Plants group. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. We have another comment from Isier in the chat box. Barbara has already responded. Thank you, Barbara. Yes, totally applicable. Cropscapes can be extended to fungi and algae as well. Please join me in thanking once again the authors of this marvelous book, Moving Crops and the Scales of History. And please make sure that you get the discount codes that I posted in the chat box. If you haven't, if you don't have the discount code, please send me a message via the chat box. I'll be very happy to share with you the discount code that you'll be able to purchase the book wherever you are. Before you all go, let me just remind you that the recording of this event will be made available in our YouTube channel, in Sci-Tech Asia's YouTube channel, so that you'll be able to watch it again if you want, or just share it with friends and colleagues. Please check our Facebook and LinkedIn, X, Instagram, and all the social media of Sci-Tech Asia for news about future events. And drop us a line if you'd like to join our mailing list. Many thanks once again for your support, and many thanks to the authors and commentators for their wonderful contributions. Thank you so much. See you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.